Welcome to Glass in Session. I'm your host, Val, and I thank you for clicking play, for subscribing, and for supporting this show. I hope you enjoyed the last episode that took us to the vineyards of Albania, and I thank you all for giving the episode on Lebanon wine earlier in May so much love, especially as Lebanon and Albania are still in the news. Now, Armenia has been on my editorial calendar for a while, and it now, too, has been in the news. So let's give it some vineyard love, shall we? First, let's find it on a map. Armenia is a landlocked country in the South Caucasus. This is a mountainous crossroads between Europe and Asia, sitting at a hinge point between the Middle East and Eastern Europe. While Armenia used to be a lot bigger, as it included major chunks of what is now Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Georgia, it's now much smaller. It covers about 30,000 or so square kilometers, or about 11,505 square miles, with a population of about 3 million people. It's just a little larger than Albania, which on georank.org, I have Albania here as 140 out of 197 countries, and Armenia as 139 out of 197 countries. For you Americans, that's somewhere between the size of Maryland and West Virginia in size. Oh, and mountains make up between 70 and 90% of the terrain, depending on what source you're looking at. Colorado Girl here says, sign me up. It shares its northern border with Georgia, a fellow ancient wine nation and rival for the title of the cradle of wine culture. Azerbaijan is to the east, with which it has had kind of a tense and complicated relationship, particularly following the 2020 war over Nagorno-Karabakh, or Artsakh. Some Armenian vineyards require military escorts during harvest, but we'll get to that later. Turkey is to the west, historically and politically fraught, but as of May 2026, direct trade has resumed for the first time in decades. Critically, Mount Ararat, Armenia's most iconic symbol, on the national coat of arms and on every Ararat brandy bottle, is actually inside Turkey, just across the border. This is a wound that has never really fully healed. Iran to the southeast is a surprisingly stable neighbor and a useful trade corridor. Or according to an interview the week this episode drops with Iran's ambassador to Armenia for Nexus Intellect Research, quote, "The relations between Iran and Armenia are civilizational and historical relations, formed upon the bedrock of thousands of years of connection and integration between the two nations." End quote. While Armenia has rivers and lakes, there is no coastline whatsoever this time. This means continental climate, frigid winters, hot, dry summers, and those dramatic diurnal or temperature swings between day and night that give wines their signature freshness and acidity. The terrain is dramatic, and if you've seen any pictures of it, it's absolutely stunning. They've got volcanic soils, high plateaus, and deep gorges. The average elevation is around 1,800 meters, which is about 6,000 feet, where I am sitting right now in Colorado Springs. The big picture, Armenia has historically been at the intersection of Persian, Ottoman, Russian, and Soviet empires, all of which have shaped and often disrupted its wine culture. Today it's pivoting firmly westward toward the EU, which is arguably the most consequential geopolitical shift for Armenian wine exports in a generation. And this brings us to history. Now you might be thinking, hey Val, let me guess, we're going to start with the Greeks. Nope. Romans? Nope. Etruscans? Not even. This is a new one for Glass in Session, as we are going to start between 6,000 and 7,000 years ago in a cave. A cave in southern Armenia. Yes, I said a cave. In the cave. Now, some of you longtime hardcore listeners may remember I did an entire episode just on wine caves. Oh, but that one started millions of years ago. We talked about dinosaurs and things and mostly dug very deep into the Cretaceous chalk and sea creatures of Champagne. We brought it forward to California for a New World comparison. Now, I skipped over this cave, on which excavations weren't really started until 2007. The cave has a name, Armenian Wine, or Bird's Cave, because all of the nests inside the cave and near the caves when it was discovered by archaeologist Boris Gasparian. And as a new birder, I think I would probably really dig this cave in addition to what we find inside of it. And it's very cool because in the last episode, we talked about the wines of Albania and the children of eagles and the Flamingo Revolution. Now we have an entire bird's cave with a winery in it. Cool. Very, very cool. Inside Armenian Wine were artifacts that could be dated from around 5,000 to 4,000 BCE, And this would be considered the Chalcolithic age, chalco being Greek for copper, lithic being stone, so kind of the copper stone age. All kinds of things were found in Armenia one. Everything from burial sites to a jar of preserved brains. Val, what are we pairing with that? The oldest shoe in the world made of leather, which was stuffed with grass, plopped under a ceramic bowl at the bottom of a pit of sheep dung. But dude, this is from the Absolute Armenia website. I don't sit around all day making this stuff up and day drinking. So, where were we? Brains, cave, shoes, sheep doo-doo. But what does all this have to do with wine? Well, there was a whole freaking winery unearthed at the same time as the doo-doo shoe. This 6,100-year-old winery literally in a cave. So it's not a wine cave per se, but a cave with a winery in it. Absolute Armenia tells us that this discovery in 2011 makes this the oldest winery in the world that we know of. So how do we know it was a winery? Because it contained all the winemaking goodies, not just vessels for holding wine and grape pips, drinking cups, etc., but an entire press and a vat used for fermenting the wine. Chemical analysis confirmed the presence of red wine pigment compounds, and wine back then was also made with not only grapes, but walnuts and plums, so those too were present amongst the wine paraphernalia. Can you visit this cave? Yes, you can. I think it's like $2 to get in. Can you drink there? No. But the village of Armenia is nearby, and this cave is located in the Vouillamoz province, where we find one of Armenia's major grape wine regions, which we'll get to shortly. I've linked up a few articles on the cave itself if you're a cave freak and want to check it out, and it's apparently very easy to get to, but we need to get to the rest of the history, which I'm going to condense very, very briefly for you. I should also mention that evidence of wild Vitis vinifera vines found in fossils date back even further than this cave's findings, so we know that grapes have grown there for probably like 11,000 years. But beyond the cave, archaeologists have discovered Iron Age wine vessels and presses. And by the time we roll up on 785 BCE, we stumble upon the first inklings of what Armenians would claim as their homeland's predecessor, or the ancient civilization of Urartia, from about 860 to 590 BCE, in what is now eastern Turkey, Armenia, and northwestern Iran. The Urartian civilization was ruled by many kings over the years, but there's one particular king, Argishti, who planted vineyards in his garden city of Tushpa, which was Arutu's capital at the time, which is now Van, Turkey, near the Armenian border. Evidence of vineyards from Ruza II, descendant of Argishti, shows the city he built southwest of Armenia's capital city of Yerevan in the 680 to 640-ish BCE timeframe. It comes to us in the form of grape seeds as well as an inscription that says, quote, "By command of the god Haldi, I have planted these vineyards," end quote. Dang, a god telling you to plant vineyards. Rock on, Ruza II. Rock on. Armenia was the first nation to adopt Christianity as a state religion in 301 CE, this current era, intertwining wine and spiritual life ever since because vines are literally carved into ancient churches and monasteries. And some of you who are maybe biblical scholars, you might recognize that I skipped over around the 500-ish CE because Armenia is credited for being the location of Noah's vineyards. You know, the guy with the zoo boat. Post-flood, the tale goes that Noah planted vineyards around Mount Ararat, which is technically in Turkey, and then got drunk and then unsavory things happened, and we won't go into that. But while there is plenty of actual evidence of viticultural activity in Armenia dating back to this time, and oh, by the way, in the Oxford Companion to Wine, or what I call the OCW, they mention the 500-ish CE timeframe to be considered Armenia's golden age of winemaking. Because the next millennium and a half would be nothing but war and invasion, the industry would meet many hurdles, but even during the Ottoman period prior to World War I, this was a genocidal period where over 1.5 million or 50% of Armenians were lost, and yet the wine persisted. As the Ottoman Empire fell, Armenia's wine industry would live to tell another story in the 19th century under Russian rule. Remember, the Tsars loved them some fermented juice of the grape, and while we're at it, distilled juice of the grape, aka brandy. In fact, Armenia's brandy biz thrived under the Russian Empire because it was far easier to transport and that brandy doesn't spoil during shipping as wine can. Vineyards fed this demand for brandy in the South Caucasus, and Armenia was at the heart of it. And although Armenia was able to experience a short spell as an independent entity, well, the Soviets rolled up on the joint and spoiled the party as the commies were wont to do around 1920. In the Soviet era, or what I refer to as the why we can't have nice things era, this was Armenia's big brandy era, and they still make brandy today. But Soviet-controlled Armenia was brandy central for the USSR, kicking quality wine production and grape growing to the curb. High yield, quantity over quality was Stalin's style. But here's the silver lining. While the Soviets focused on the flat valley land and high-yield vines, leaving the hillside vineyards in the hands of the villagers very quietly kept these vines alive. And this is why you can still find vines over 100 years old there, sometimes up to 150. Although once they again gained their independence, the country kind of took an impoverished turn. The modern Armenian wine revival really didn't kick off until the early 2000s, driven by diaspora investment, international expertise, and a focus on quality over quantity. The number of wineries grew from around 10 or so in 2010 to roughly 180 to over 200 a day, depending on how you're counting, because there are various ways of counting the wineries, and production was up more than 50% between 2015 and 2024. And there are, as of right now, just over 15,000 hectares under vine, or about 38,000 acres. Production is very small, therefore high-priced, due to costs of transportation and manual labor. But this is going to bring us to the regions. While there are no official appellations in Armenia, there are 5 main regions, each with its own personality. Well, there were 6. I'm going to talk about the 5. I'm going to get to the 6th. All are along the western and southwestern edges of Armenia except for the Tavush. Further south we find the Vouillamoz. It's a narrow plateau with some of the highest elevation vineyards in the world, reaching almost 6,000 feet above sea level. The wines from here can tell you they've been through something. The Armenian Wine cave, where the world's oldest winery was found, it sits right there in that gorge country to the south. And this region is where we find some of the better wines being made. But north of the Vouillamoz is Ararat. It is sun-drenched, it is semi-desert, flatter, a little less austere than the Vouillamoz, but a wide variety of wines are produced here too. Armavir is north and further west of Ararat, near the Turkish border in western Armenia. It's quite dry and sunny here with hot summers, but the wines can be very rich and expressive, from ripe AF grapes that sometimes really just find their way to brandy. I wouldn't sleep on this region, as Michel Roland, a very famous wine consultant, has had his hands in also one of the bigger wineries in Armenia, the Karas winery. That winery is based here, and I believe they have vineyards, if not operations, in Ararat Valley as well, at least what I found on their website. The Aragat Sultan is semi-desert. Lower in elevation, wines here are going to be softer in profile with distinctive minerality, and this region is known to be kind of the stomping grounds, see what I did there, stomping grounds of the native white grape Vaskahat, which we'll get to. The Tavush, you don't see it written up a lot. Usually you just see the first 4 I mentioned, but this one is in northeastern Armenia. It's hilly, but also the lowest when it comes to elevation. And according to vinography, the Tavush province has the most trees in Armenia, and the humidity here is quite characteristic of the region, along with a mild climate. And now I will explain why sometimes you look at a map of Armenia, and there is a 1,700 square mile chunk of Armenia that seems to be, shall I say, missing. In fact, the map on the Karas Winery webpage still has this as part of Armenia. It's in the southeastern corner on the border with Azerbaijan, and you may be wondering why I'm wading into this non-diplomatic dick swinging over a piece of mountainous land that has been a contentious subject for 30 plus years. That is because this Nagorno-Karabakh, or Artsakh for Armenians, who are the historical residents of this area, is an important aspect of Armenian wine. Just as Crimea, currently Russian-occupied, is part of Ukraine's wine history and culture, I'm going to talk about it. A little more history here. The mainly Armenian population has governed this region as the somewhat independent Republic of Artsakh since the fall of the Soviet Union 35 years or so. In this case, it was the Azerbaijani, or what they call the Azeri military, that launched the most recent attacks in this decade in what is known as the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War in October 2020. And it was the Russians who had a military presence, mostly here keeping the peace, and actually helped broker the ceasefire. But unfortunately, it all went to hell as many Armenians fled, as in around 100,000 to 150,000, something like that, and roughly 7,000 people died during 6 weeks of fighting in 2020. As of this recording, I believe the region is now, if not officially, under the control of Azerbaijan since 2023. Now, how does the wine industry feel this loss of territory? Because here's the thing. It's not just about territory. People lost their homes, they lost their vineyards, but they lost this sense of place. It's not just the properties, the vines, the wineries, but it's the oak forests that have a particular fine grain to the oak and add a specific flavor to the barrels. Just like with American oak, you get, dill or what have you, French oak, you get vanilla. There is a certain spice that you get from Armenian oak, and they're having a hard time sourcing the oak for their unique barrels. And I do believe 15 wineries from Artsakh have restarted their operations, like the Katara winery. Did they smuggle 1,000 Kanagdoni or Sereni vines from war-torn Artsakh and replant them in their new digs just outside of Yerevan? Yeah, maybe they did, with the help of Russian peacekeepers, actually. But I've linked up the Punch article that has photos of the complete story, and you can see pictures of the vines. And Stubborn Val thought you should know about this part of Armenia and possibly put it on your wino radar if it's not already. You're going to hear about this area again. But let's get on with the grape gap, shall we? There are somewhere between 400 and 500 native grape varieties in Armenia. While in the wine world, we often speak of pre-phylloxera vines when referring to ungrafted vines saved from the scourge of phylloxera in the late 19th, early 20th century. In Armenia, winemakers demarcate vineyards as pre- and post-Soviet. Same existential drama, different scourge. And while I will not torture you with naming all the indigenous varieties of Armenian grapes, I'm going to hit on the top, red and white. The Armenian Wine, or Areni, is the thin-skinned, albeit king of Armenian viticulture or Armenia's wine culture. Areni is one of those grapes that's distinctly Armenian. The wines tend to be medium to full-bodied, with ripe berry and cherry notes, as well as violets, and a distinctive peppery spice, and they are very amenable to aging, especially in that aforementioned Armenian oak. It is thin-skinned like the Pinot Noir, as I mentioned, but it's got that spicy note, kind of like Pinot Noir with more tude. And you can find these dessert-style wines and rosés made with this grape as well. It is an ancient variety that is believed to call the area around the village of the same name, Areni, home, which is in the Superstar Vayats Dior region near the Azerbaijan border. Now, Vuskahat is the ancient white grape of Armenia, so if Areni is king, this is the thick-skinned queen, and she can be made into light floral styles or something age-worthy, rich, with stone fruit, lots of complexity. Some are comparing it to Chenin. I saw many articles where they compare it to a Chenin Blanc and all the different styles you can coax out of a Chenin Blanc grape, which makes it one of my favorites. Very, very versatile. But apparently, you can still find some of these vines that are over 150 years old. Now, that is not to say the other red and white varieties aren't important, like the aforementioned Kanadogni or Sereni, or the Tozo or the white Katuni. Each region is going to have its specialty, but you can pretty much find all the styles in Armenia as a whole. The red, the white, full-bodied, light-bodied, sparkling wines, rosés, desserts, and even a style that's being kind of resurrected, if you will, the orange or amber wines, or wines just using these clay vessels called karas. They're reminiscent of their neighbor Georgia's kvevari, so they're these giant clay jars or vessels. So definitely be on the lookout for that. Listener, if you have not watched the Psalm TV episode, I had not even heard of it. It's called Cup of Salvation. It's about Armenian wine, and I've linked it up for you. You can watch it free on something called Tubi. There's a few ads, but I used that time to make notes. If you're like me, you watch any show about wine or maybe a cooking show the way normal people watch sport. You'll recognize some wine personalities in this film and professionals. And I wanted to bring this to your attention because I talked a lot about vineyards being in the line of fire during conflict. You get to see Armenian winemaker Zahe and his daughter Amy, and you will see the Keushgarian family winemakers, Zahe and his daughter Amy, struggle with the idea of harvesting grapes, where they actually strap on body armor for their Keush sparkling wine from a vineyard that lies between Armenian and Azeri military bases. A little surprise, about 2/3 into the film, which is hinted at in the beginning, is Zahe's project to make wine from grapes grown in Iran. This has long been believed to be ground zero for the Vitis vinifera species, the OG vine from which most of our wine grapes hail. And apparently there were about 300 wineries or so in Iran before the 1979 revolution, by the way, before the oppressive police state terrorizing crap ruined everything. In A Cup of Salvation, the footage is fascinating as Zahe tries to obtain the grapes from Iranian vineyards, get them across the border, and then make wine with them for the first time, as far as we know, in 40 years. Did I snivel at the end? Yes, I did. So I'm not going to spoil it any further. But I really hope someday to be able to do an episode about the revitalization of the wine industry in Iran. If the arrogant, ignorant, and unqualified morons on the world stage currently making complete asses of America haven't destroyed it and everything else by then, that is. And you know what? F it. I think my next episode will be on Iran's winemaking history and grape culture, kind of like I did for Afghanistan. Let me see what I can gather on that because I can't help myself. But meanwhile, back to Iran's neighbor, Armenia. Here are some other things to know. There are current events that make this episode timely, not just because they're Iran's neighbor. For example, in May 2026, as I previously mentioned, their other neighbor, Turkey, lifted the restrictions on direct trade with Armenia. This was a seismic geopolitical shift. It could open new export channels. Their border has been closed for over 30 years, mostly over that whole Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, as Turkey sided with Azerbaijan. Russia, meanwhile, banned several Armenian wines and cognac brands in May of 2026. As Armenia pivots westward toward the EU, its wine is caught in the geopolitical crossfire. And I linked up an article from, I think, the Moscow Times on that, where you can read about like flowers and all the other things that the Russians are no longer importing from Armenia. Another thing that's interesting is Armenia this year held its first ever bilateral summit with the EU in Yerevan. The country is firmly charting a course away from Russia, so they're looking for new markets, new opportunities, and new wine drinkers. Hey, there's one here. U.S. only gets about 7% of their wine. Russia gets to get the big chunk of Armenian wine. So it is important for other countries to buy up. And Yerevan also just hosted the Eurovision Young Musicians Competition in 2026, the cultural spotlight squarely on Armenia right now. And if you've ever lived in Europe or watched Eurovision, it's a lot of fun to watch. So I like that they're doing this Young Musicians Competition as well. The same weekend as the Eurovision competition, Yerevan was also celebrating Yerevan Wine Days. And according to the website, the festival welcomed around 180,000 visitors in 2025, roughly 40% of them tourists. With an economic infusion valued at about $32 million US. They had participation from hundreds of wineries and partners focused not just on the wine, but Armenian culture, cuisine, music, and so much more. So I'm going to bring it home with this. Armenia has somehow managed to survive all the obstacles history has thrown at it. They've fermented it. They've aged it nicely into something that's hopeful and rich with culture and meaning beyond a glass of juice. And this is what I love about wine. From an ancient cave to decanter awards, this is a country that never stopped making wine even when the empires and the Soviets and the geopolitics were like, yeah, maybe you should stop. And they're like, nah, we got this. I hope this episode was as interesting to you as it was inspiring for me. I learned so much in researching these episodes, as you can tell from the sources I include in my show notes. There is still so much more to learn, not just about the wine, but the cultures, the histories, the countries, the international relationships, the things going on in our world that set massive events in motion that will, inevitably, end up telling their story in a glass of wine. I am so honored that you chose, of all the other wine podcasts out there, mine this week. Thank you so much for sharing these crazy times with me in your ears and for subscribing, which keeps that precious spot open for me in your podcast feed. You can always reach out to me via email. Email me at val@glassandsession.com or at glassandsession@proton.me. On the socials, pick your poison. Blue Sky, Glass in Session. Vino with Val on Threads and Instagram. You'll see Glass in Session trademarked in my bio. I'm Spoutable, Glass in Session. I'm on Substack now, glassandsession.substack.com. Vino with Val on Pinterest and Facebook /Glass in Session. Connect with me on LinkedIn, Valerie Caruso, DWS, CWE, FWS Letters, Wine Stuff, and audiobook narrator, which reminds me you can find this podcast and the latest audiobooks I've narrated on Audible. Of course, you can find me anywhere you download your podcast because you're listening right now. There is Glass in Session swag in my TeePublic store, linked way at the bottom of the show notes and on my website. Thank you to those of you who are supporting this show. Glass in Session is a production and registered trademark of Vino with Val, LLC. Music is Write Your Story by Joy Stock. Website is glassandsession.com.